I'm delighted that Ralph Schoellhammer was able to join me from Vienna. Ralph, welcome to Reality Bites. Look, you've been talking a lot about this question of, are renewable sources of energy enough? Can we get there? What's your conclusion?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. And I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I think the answer to the question depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Right? Let me put it this way. If you say you want to be an energy poor society, renewables could suffice. If you say you want to be a prosperous, energy rich society, they won't. And I think a lot of the debate that we're having is kind of ignoring the necessity to look at the trade-offs. So it's what is theoretically feasible and possible, right, comes at a cost. So you can say you get rid of coal, of gas, of oil. Can you hypothetically do this? Of course you can, but it will have severe consequences. And I think very often we only talk about the is it possible side of the equation, but not what the consequences are.
But let's be clear, no country has achieved anything like close to zero emissions in the electricity sector. We're not deal with the rest just yet, just in the electricity sector. No country has achieved anything close to that, 80% or 90% clean electricity on renewables, right?
Some countries are close, but again, there we have to look at what's the economic, the geographical, the topographical makeup of these countries. For example, Uruguay is doing very well, but then you have to look at the per capita energy use of the average inhabitant of Uruguay. It's significantly lower, as is the living standard of, let's say, the average inhabitant of the United States or Western Europe. They are blessed with hydropower. Right? They are very much blessed with wind energy. So some countries have geographical conditions that will allow them to tap more into renewables than other countries. But in order to be an industrialized economy, and especially industry is the key here, we tend to forget this, right? The production of industrial grade steam needs more energy than all of our transportations worldwide, right? This is what we always tend to, when we talk about these things, we think about cars, right? And we think about charging our phones, but we also have factories we need to run. There's a new thing that's going to come up is data centers, the training of algorithms. Like all of this is very, very energy/electricity intensive. And to do this, 80%, 100% renewables, particularly wind and solar, is simply impossible. And let me tell you really quickly how we know this, because you always have to look at what people say and what people do. So we know that all the major companies are still at least paying lip service to ESG, to environmental issues. But both Microsoft and Amazon are both now inquiring how to build small nuclear reactors, how to get into the nuclear game, because they know that the future of artificial intelligence, that the future of data centers needs reliable 24/7, 365 electricity. And the only reliable sources we have for this are either nuclear or fossil fuels. It is simple as that.
Yeah, that's right. So here's my experience of my last 3 weeks, if you'll stick with me a bit, Ralph. I started in Finland. I visited the Olkiluoto 3 nuclear reactor, very impressive thing. Finland runs on 90 to 95% clean electricity, and it's cheap, amongst the cheapest in Europe. I then went on to Sweden, same deal. They've got a lot of hydro, some wind, and they've got nuclear, same deal, 95% clean energy and cheap. And then I crossed the Øresund bridge to Copenhagen, completely different. You see the wind turbines in the sea on the way across. And then I got into Copenhagen. Newspapers are full of stories about how expensive electricity is. Is this just a transition phase? Or is it eventually, if they push hard enough, they put enough wind and solar in and enough batteries, will energy prices come down?
No, they won't, because supply is not going to keep up with demand. And you hear this every time when people talk about transition, kind of towards the end, they say, and we also need demand management. But what does demand management basically mean? It means that at some point, the government will tell you when to use electricity, when to use energy, because they won't be able to provide it 24/7. But that's, of course, a huge discomfort or inconvenience, again, for private citizens, but also for industries. And we tend to forget industries, particularly manufacturing, they will go where energy is reliable. I mean, it's completely absurd to me. We have now a Europe-wide trend, and this is true all over Europe with few small exceptions, of de-industrialization. Right? Manufacturing in Europe, kind of industrial production, has been declining now for almost 10 years. And almost in every country, without exception, industry says it's energy prices. It's energy prices. It's also bureaucracy, right? There's some other factors as well, but energy prices are always among the top three. And you still have politicians who kind of plug the fingers in their ears and say, nah, I can't hear you. So they tell us what's going on. And then they go to Alabama, they go to Texas, they go to China. Right? In the past, as the Germans did, right? They said we're just going to supply our industries with gas from Russia, but pretend that our homemade energy is all clean and all renewable. So there have been these, twisting themselves into pretzels when it came to facing reality. And as I always said, the point is not to say that it can't be done. The point is to say it can be done, but the price is going to be horrific. And as a good friend of mine, the econ and commodity blogger Doomberg tends to say, on the path from prosperity to poverty is revolution. And this is what we already, by the way, see in the upcoming Euro elections. Like, the Europeans are getting poorer, and the energy policy is a huge element in why this is happening. And the people don't like it. It's completely absurd. The argument to say, reduce your living standards because maybe it will make a minor contribution to affect climate change 30 years down the road, that is not a winning proposition. And once again, if you look at the numbers, I mean, you could sink Western Europe into the sea. It would not really make a dent into what's happening to the climate over the next 20, 25, 30 years. And I mean, God bless them. The people know this, right? They increasingly see that a lot of this is, I have to admit, driven by ideology. This does not mean that somebody is against, finding ways of producing clean energy / electricity, but we actually have something that can do this, and that is nuclear energy. But ironically enough, even those who say it's all about emissions also don't like nuclear, which of course raises the suspicion that maybe it's not really about emissions after all, right? Maybe it is more driven by the degrowth agenda, by this idea that, getting poorer is a way to atone for the sins of the past. That Europe, we were rich in the past, now it's the other people's turn and we have to get poor. So I think there's a huge ideological element to it that we don't talk about enough.
Well, that's right. And in Australia, as you know, we're having a very intense debate, which will go into the next election, about whether we should lift our moratorium on nuclear. And those who are against it, including the Labor government, say, well, nuclear is too expensive. But I don't actually pick that up from my tour around Europe. I mean, sure, investment in nuclear energy is very expensive, but then investment in almost anything in terms of capital is expensive. But people are paying cheaper energy, cheaper electricity bills consistently in countries where they have nuclear or a whole lot of hydroelectricity, more than Australia could ever have. But they're paying higher prices in countries like Germany, where I am now, or in Denmark, where they're trying to go that renewable route alone. Is that too simplistic an analysis?
No. It's. I think it's not simplistic. I think you're absolutely right. But I think even there, let us kind of go to the root cause of this issue. Nuclear has become expensive because we made it expensive. I mean, this, by the way, was also the fault of the nuclear industry, because the nuclear industry, particularly after Chernobyl, when kind of the nuclear, fear craze broke out, they said, no, we're going to make it super safe. So they added on safety regulation after safety regulation after safety regulation, but it was never enough. So it got more and more expensive. For example, when they built a nuclear power plant in Finland, I talked to an engineer there. They said there was they had a piece they had to use, and it was not perfectly welded. So there were some minor issues, but it was not a crucial piece. So that piece would not have been the core at a nuclear meltdown or something. But the regulations were in a way that they had to redo all of it. So they had to send they could have used it, right? It was not a perfect fit, but they could have used it. But they had to redo the whole thing because it was not a perfect fit. And in a nuclear power plant, everything needs to be a perfect fit down to the last element. And this is also the reason why it took them significantly longer than they originally planned it. As it was originally planned. But when people say, well, that's not true, we have very good evidence that it is true. Look at Canada in the 70s and 80s. Look at France in the 70s and 80s. They basically built a new reactor every year. And if you look, by the way, at the carbon intensity of the French electricity grid or the Quebec electricity grid, I mean, it's wonderful. It's as when nuclear goes up, emissions go down like this. And the reason why they could do it, because in Canada, it's the so-called CANDO, which is also a funny name, I think, because it's very apt. that can do reactors. They agreed on a design, and they started to build the same design over and over and over and over again. This is the same thing they did in France. It's the same thing they're currently trying to do in China. And as you do this, right, with growing experience, with growing standardization, prices also start to go down. And the same is true with regulation. There are many areas within the realm of nuclear energy where you could loosen regulations without increasing significantly the risk connected with it. But we don't do it. This is a political problem. It's not a problem of physics. I mean, we know nuclear power since the 1960s. So we are in this absurd situation that we claim a technology we could build en masse in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, cheaper than we can now. We claim, well, actually, nobody really knows why that would be the case, because we have better technology, we have better production processes, we have microchips, semiconductors, all things that didn't even exist when nuclear power plants were developed in the first generation. So technically, if we would use the technology we have and abandon parts of the regulation, we could build nuclear power on the cheap, but it's the lack of political will. So it's the laws of politics that prevent this from happening and not the laws of physics. But I have to admit, the anti-nuclear campaigners were very successful from Australia to Austria. There is tremendous fear among the population that nuclear power is basically, the beginning of the end of humanity, and every nuclear power plant is not different from a nuclear bomb that is just waiting to go off, even though they're entirely different things. And it's very, very hard to convince people. Like every time you tell people that in Fukushima there was at best one casualty due to radiation, even that is not entirely clear, people don't believe you. The same is true when you tell them we don't know a single incident where a human being has been harmed by nuclear waste. But you can tell this, right? You can quote the numbers, you can cite the data. People say, no, too dangerous. And that's very difficult. It's a feeling, it's a gut feeling that's very difficult to overcome.
And Ralph, well, we have a problem in Australia, and I no doubt this is true more widely, that the opposition to nuclear is almost entirely being driven and funded by the renewable energy sector. So and who can blame them? They have a vested interest in seeing off their competitors and stop their competitors getting a foothold in Australia. But it really does come down to that, doesn't it? It's one sector fighting against a technological competitor, which they know probably is actually going to be more efficient and effective at producing electricity around the clock.
Oh, not just, I have to admit, not just the renewable sector, also the fossil fuel sector. Because contrary, again, what one hears in the media, the owners and the management of, Exxon, Chevron, and all these companies, Saudi Aramco, they are very, very smart. I mean, they know that renewables will never be capable of replacing other forms of energy production. Because if the wind doesn't blow, if the sun doesn't shine, who's going to fill the gap? Nuclear could fill the gap. Or a gas power plant could fill the gap, or a coal power plant could fill the gap, or in the worst case, an oil power plant could fill the gap. So even the fossil fuel industries know that if nuclear is taken off the table, they will always remain in the game, because you always need somebody to back up the renewables. Some people will say, but what about batteries? Again, grid level battery storage, I'll talk about it once we have it. I always hear technology is almost there. Well, this is the same what we hear about nuclear fusion, right? Nuclear fusion is always just 1 year away. And the magical battery is always just 1 year away. Once we have it, I'm happy to talk about it. But for now, the fossil fuel industry knows that the more we push for renewables, the more they will be needed as a backup. And this is what keeps them in place. So this was the thing. Nuclear power is basically fighting a two-front war against the fossil fuel lobby on the one hand and the renewables lobby on the other hand, even though it would, by all available evidence, it is by all available evidence, a miraculous technology. I mean, nuclear power is, the more you get into it, it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, it's reliable, it's clean. You can, by the way, build it almost everywhere. I mean, the largest nuclear power plant in the United States is in Arizona. It's basically in the middle of the desert, right? It's run more or less by sewage water from neighboring cities. The technology is also getting better, because many of these nuclear power plants were built, as I said before, in the 70s and 80s. So kind of, if you would have newer designs, they would even be better. They would even be more sustainable. So there's a lot that could be done. But as you correctly pointed out, there's a very strong lobby against it. Politicians are like, flags in the wind. they turn wherever they think the electorate is. But all of this is going to come at a price. I mean, we saw this last year in Australia. If you compare Western Australia and Eastern Australia, right? Where in the Western Australia usually has better relations with the mining industry, with the fossil fuel industry compared to the other half of Australia, and they had the same problems. I mean, a country blessed with natural resources like Australia, I mean, you guys should have energy for next to nothing. I mean, you have it all. You have coal, you have gas, you have uranium. I mean, the electricity in Australia should be, 1 cent per megawatt hour because you have it all. But unfortunately, very often politics gets in the way. And to just one more point on this, yes, and Australia of course, Australia should do solar. Of course, Australia should do the things as well because you have the conditions to do it. But if the Australians would be smart, you would use your fossil fuel industry to produce, for example, solar panels at home. You will build a soup to nuts solar industry at home because you have all the necessary requirements and not imported from China. Because this is the thing that when I always have people say, well, but renewables, they make us independent. No, they don't. 98% of the production chains in solar energy are owned by China. As we now see, the battery production chains are owned by China, and the electric vehicle market is about to be dominated by China. So I don't really even see the geopolitical advantage of moving into the renewables direction.
Can you give me any hope that in the wake of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that followed, that there's a more sensible position setting in Europe?
Oh yeah, I mean we'll see. That the question is I don't think so much whether sanity will at some point reassert itself. I think the question is how much pain will it take until it happens, and how many of the negative consequences can be reversed. I mean, you're currently in Berlin. Like I said, we have a couple of more minutes, but you're currently in Berlin, and one of the largest petrochemical industries, usually symbolized by the company BASF. Right, they now announced again they want to move production out of Germany. Now, even if the Germans find back to their senses and reverse the worst outcomes of their energy policies, how many of these companies will come back? Because as you certainly know, and as your viewers and listeners know, kind of building a refinery, building a complex petrochemical plant, I mean, these are long-term investments. So if they say we're going to build this in Alabama, in Texas, and then they build it, and then the Germans say, no, come back. We saw the mistakes in the past, and we're going to alter course. I mean, they will say, yeah, that's amazing, but we just built this huge factory here. We're not going to just close up shop and come back. So this is, I think, the big question. Even if people realize and if politicians realize that the course of the last 30 years was mistaken and they start to reverse it, can it be fast enough? I mean, the pain is coming. I mean, the European economies, if you look at all the key elements from companies to energy to startup formation, capital availability. I mean, the European economy is hanging by a thread. I mean, we are walking into an abyss, and it seems that everybody is ignoring it. I mean, I forgot from which company, from a major Swedish company recently said that Europe is on the best way to become an open air museum, right? A great food, great sites, great art, great culture, beautiful people, but nothing of any kind of relevance in the economic sector. But the problem is, and this is where he is mistaken, once you have no longer any say in the global economy, the good food, the great art, the beautiful women, and all the other things I mentioned, they will disappear as well. Right? This is the thing, because if people can no longer afford the fine food, well, then you'll stop producing fine food. If you no longer can afford to have artists, then the art is also going to disappear. And the Europeans are whistling past the graveyard here in many, many respects.
Ralph, we could talk more, and I hope we will in the future, because you bring rare common sense to this topic. But thank you very much for joining us today on Reality Bites.
Thanks for having me, Nick.